Hey, it's Astraeus, and today I want to talk about what it's like to live in space and the history of living in space. You've probably seen the videos and how they eat and how they drink and that kind of thing, and it's always been a real interest of mine, learning about how that all works and then how that's going to work in the future. So I wanted to dive into a little bit of the history of living in space and how we've been doing it, how we started doing it, how we've learned from it, and then kind of what the future might hold for us. So let's get started. So some of the things that I want to go over are going to be hygiene in space, sleeping in space, and eating in space, kind of the main necessities to live a fairly normal human life, right? So when you think of living in space, you probably think of the ISS, which has been inhabited by astronauts or cosmonauts or whatever they want to call it, from about 18 different countries. It is about the size of a 6-bedroom house. It's pretty big, and it can contain lots of astronauts, but usually it's about 4 astronauts at a time. It is traveling about 17,000 miles an hour above us, which means basically it's kind of falling constantly into Earth, and then it's just rotating around, which is why the astronauts in the ISS experience zero gravity. At the speed at which it is orbiting the Earth, the astronauts actually experience about 16 sunrises and sunsets, because it's going around the Earth about every 90 minutes. So in November of 2020, the ISS celebrated its 20th year of having astronauts up in the ISS. The average mission length for an astronaut to be on the ISS is about 6 months. So when we were first looking at going to the moon back in the 60s, we really didn't know that much about how the human body would interact with space. So when it came to eating and hygiene and sleeping, all that kind of stuff, at first it was very experimental. When they first would send the astronauts up, they really didn't have any way to kind of clean themselves except for sort of like a wet wipe situation, and they would usually stay in the clothes that they were wearing the whole time, so they did not smell the greatest. And then once we came out of just the kind of the Apollo era, where they were just sending astronauts to the moon and sending them to orbit the Earth, we actually had the thing called the Skylab, which was an American sort of space station around the Earth. They actually had a sort of what we would consider more of a normal shower situation, more than the ISS has. It was sort of like a tube that they would sit in, and they would be able to have like water on them, and it took about 2 hours actually to like completely shower and dry off using sort of like a vacuum to vacuum up all of the water so that it wouldn't float into the rest of the space station and interfere with all the electronics. Astronauts in the ISS usually use a liquid soap for their body, but they use a rinseless shampoo for their head. So you can watch some videos of ladies with long hair in the ISS and how they wash the hair. So their hair is floating up all over them, and what they do is they squirt a little bit of water into the hair, roots of the hair really, and then they put the rinseless shampoo and they work it in, and then they try to use a towel to just get all of the water off that they can and absorb it into the towel, because otherwise, like I said before, it would float away. But it usually if it's stuck within the hair, it'll evaporate, and then it gets used again in the recycling system they use on the ISS for water, which means that the water that they could have been using for washing their hair might be going into their meal in a couple days. So one question that astronauts get asked a lot is the peeing situation and the pooping situation, which is really funny to me, and I can't imagine the amount of times that astronauts get asked about this, but it was of course one of my first questions when I started researching into it. I actually read a book on it that's there's really quite a few good books out there if you want to get into it, but they basically pee into sort of the same kind of contraption that you would use to vacuum off the water when you showered, so they're just peeing into a sort of vacuum. And the pooping situation is not exactly what you'd think. You actually have a little baggie that is in a little container, and you have to line the container with the baggie. You poop into the bag, you close up the bag, and you shove it into the container. And I think there's a common misconception about where the poop goes in the ISS. I think a lot of people think that they just kind of eject it out of the ISS and then eventually it'll burn up in the atmosphere on its way down or something like that. That's not quite the case, but it's kind of true. When they're doing re-entry and bringing the astronauts home, they actually have a specific cargo area that will get disintegrated in re-entry, so it'll just be burned up. So that's kind of the trash and the poop and that kind of the biohazards will go in there, and then it'll burn up on re-entry rather than it just being floated out into space and hope that it might fall down sometime. Because a big issue that we're having, that we're going to be seeing a lot more in the future, is space trash. I mean, if you've seen WALL-E, you kind of see what we could be facing in the future with all of the satellites crowding and trying to figure out how much space junk is out there and how much we have to avoid that, like, crashes into the ISS can crash into satellites and that kind of thing. I don't think they'd be wanting to put any more space trash out there if they can help it. So now, sleeping in space. So when you think of going to the moon or going up in space at all, probably the last thing on your mind is going to be sleep, because there's going to be so much excitement and anticipation for the launch and then orbiting the Earth for a while and then eventually getting to the moon and then getting to go on to the moon or the ISS. Sleep's not really something that you want to have in your forefront of your mind. But for the astronauts to be able to do their job correctly, they need their sleep. So when the first Apollo missions with Neil Armstrong, when they got onto the moon, they originally had planned for the astronauts to sleep before their first EVA, which they really didn't work out because they were so excited to go out and step onto the moon that they just didn't sleep at all. They ended up doing the EVA sooner than expected, just so that the astronauts could get out of the way and then try to get some sleep. When they finally come back into the lunar lander, they actually had to stay inside their suits because the mission control was afraid of them breathing in any of the moon dust if they were to take off their suits with their boots still on. So they had to figure out a way to get comfortable within the lunar landing pod, which was already super small and cramped with all the different devices that were in there to keep them alive, that they ended up really not sleeping at all. So they tried to improve this with the later Apollo missions going to the moon. Hammocks were installed. Sometimes they would eventually get to the point where they would have to keep troubleshooting because some of the astronauts, as they came, they realized that, oh, well, the sun was beaming into their lunar pod, and so they couldn't sleep because of the sun. They were too cold. There was too much noise, the ambient noise from the lunar pod itself, making noises and all that kind of thing. So really, sleep as an astronaut back in the Apollo days, not so successful. Then we come into the ISS and, of course, Skylab as well. And in the ISS, you have a sort of like little sleeping pod. It kind of looks like a gym locker, but a little bit bigger. So basically, you have this little hatch, you have a computer in there, you have a sleeping bag that you can strap into the wall, if you want to call it the wall. The sleeping bag's strapped into a wall, and you can snuggle into it, and they have armholes for the astronauts so they can, type on their computer or read or watch movies or whatever in their 8 allotted hours for downtime when they're supposed to be sleeping. So what's something that's really funny about sleeping as an astronaut is that since you're weightless, and a lot of times they'll keep their arms out of the armholes, is that they'll look like zombies when they're sleeping because their arms just start floating up and they just start sitting there like this, and there's no pillow or anything like that because you don't have to have the weight of your head rested on anything because it's weightless. They have to learn how to sleep. There's a lot of times where they'll have restless nights and they'll just go stare out the window, which, like, same, I would do that too. But they have sleep psychologists on hand to help them. They can take melatonin, and then even if they're having such a really hard time going to sleep, they'll even prescribe them prescription drugs to help them fall asleep. There's a lot of psychology behind getting enough sleep to be able to perform the tasks that they have to do while they are up there for their limited stay. So now we got hygiene and sleep out of the way, and so the last thing I really wanted to talk about was space food, which is most people's favorite, I think, because if you ever go to a museum or that is anything to do with space or has one section related to space, you're always gonna find space astronaut ice cream, right? Well, it turns out that ice cream, that freeze-dried stuff, actually isn't ever used in space, mostly because it's so crumbly that it ends up getting everywhere, and they wouldn't be able to keep it from floating into the electronics and that kind of thing and sensitive equipment. So the astronaut food that you eat here on Earth never really is eaten in space. So I find that kind of interesting. If they do, astronauts actually do eat ice cream, but it's usually the frozen kind. The first types of food that were eaten in space were tube food. So it was kind of like those applesauce tubes you can get at the store. The first American to eat food in space was John Glenn aboard the Friendship 7 in 1962. So they were really trying to figure out if, when you are weightless, if people could digest food in that weightless environment. So the food that was sent with him was applesauce in a tube and sugar tablets with water. So this they finally demonstrated just by him eating this that yes, it could be digested, everything in your body can work normally even if you're in a zero-G environment. The first time solid food was eaten in a zero-G environment was on the Gemini 3. Astronaut John Young carried 2 meals, which was a complete surprise to his crewmates. He actually brought sandwiches from a deli in Florida. It's about $10,000 per pound to send stuff up to the ISS. So it really is important that these things, the food is the least amount of weight that it can be, which is why they dehydrate it all so that you can rehydrate it when you get up to the ISS. If you were like me and you've read The Martian or watched The Martian, I always kind of assumed that it was similar to the ISS in that they had potatoes, like real potatoes for Thanksgiving. That's not really a thing, although they do have real Thanksgiving up on the ISS. They have the normal fixings of stuffing and cranberry sauce and turkey and all that fun stuff, but no real potatoes, which is kind of a disappointment. So nowadays on the ISS, the US and Russia kind of go halvesies on what food gets sent up, which is part of the reason that it was such a big deal for the SpaceX rockets to be going up into the ISS and delivering people and other stuff as well, because we haven't been contributing as much since the shuttle program shut down. So we were finally able to send things from the US to the ISS for the first time in about 10 years with that program. So food can taste a lot different in space. The lack of gravity actually causes a phenomenon known as fluid shift, which kind of makes you feel like your head is stuffed up, and it kind of affects the sense of taste and smell, which means that astronauts really like spicy food a lot more because of that. And also because of the zero gravity, aromas from the food that you're making don't disperse as, it doesn't rise like it does here on Earth. So it doesn't disperse as evenly throughout the space station, which I think is kind of interesting. So if someone makes a tuna sandwich on the ISS, thankfully you won't have to smell it if you're not near them. So what is the future of living in space going to look like? Eventually I'd like to see us have some sort of spaceship that has centrifugal motion as a way to create an artificial gravity within our space stations, especially on the Gateway, which we're not going to get there anytime soon, I don't think, but I would like to see that especially for when we travel to Mars eventually, because I think that's going to create a more normal environment for us humans to live in on our way to going to Mars. I think also just cultivating a way to be able to grow plants while we are in space and traveling, and eventually when we get to Mars and on the moon, not only for eating purposes but also psychologically. It's actually proven to be a lot better for astronauts' health when they see green living things. So when they started to send up things to grow on the ISS, like flowers and lettuce, the astronauts would scramble to volunteer to be able to take care of these plants because it's just so good for its psychological health. One thing that I am a little bit afraid of as far as it goes for the future of space living is how privatized the space industry is becoming. I'm a little afraid that it's gonna really lean into capitalism and kind of go back to the days of colonialism, and we're going to see a lot of people have to live in not so great conditions in space because there's a lot of things that astronauts need to be able to be psychologically, physically, mentally healthy, and I'm afraid that things are going to be cut due to cost, because it costs a lot of money to send anything into space. So I'm really hopeful for living on the moon and the lunar missions that it's going to be a good way to set the standard for living in space. I'm really hopeful that space law is going to come to the forefront of all of this so that we can think of human rights before we go up into space and just send people out to live out there. But I'm also a little concerned because if you think back to the beginning of the space race, there was something called Operation Paperclip, which I'm looking at doing a video of in the future because that was my capstone for my German major in college. Basically, it's where after the World War II, America brought over quite a few Nazi scientists in order to accelerate our work in the space race. So the beginnings of NASA kind of didn't start on a great foot. So I'm really hoping that we learn from our mistakes and we don't repeat the past. What would you like to see in this future space living? Would you want to see more people up there in space? Do you want to see us colonize the moon and live up there? What do you want to see like within space living? Would you rather have, zero gravity, or would you rather have gravity? So let me know what you think in the comments below, and give it a like if you want to see more space related stuff. And yeah, that's what I'm into this week.